President Cyril Ramaphosa is expected to finalise his cabinet, I should say president-elect, which will comprise members that have agreed to enter the government of national unity. Now, during his election campaign, Ramaphosa said addressing unemployment and the high cost of living were among his key priorities. Let's unpack the story further. Joining us is Xolelwa Kashe-Katiya. She is the project lead at Indlulamithi South Africa Scenarios. Xolelwa, it's always a pleasure having you. Thanks very much indeed for coming on. Is it cynical for us to say that we've heard this before, that high up on the agenda is unemployment and the high cost of living?
Good afternoon, Michelle, and thank you for having me, and good afternoon to your viewers at home. I mean, this has been a priority since the founding of our democracy in 1994, and it seems to be one of the biggest challenges that we have as a nation to actually deal with these, very important economic issues, especially where unemployment is concerned, but also the issue of inequality that we still have not managed to reduce 30 years on.
So where are we going wrong? Because, our policies are there. The president says the right things whenever we talk about the cost of living crisis, whenever we talk about being the most unequal country in the world. Our unemployment rate, 45% for young people. Where are we going wrong?
Well, what we've identified in terms of the work that we've been doing as Indlulamithi, as you know, we've had to refresh the scenarios that had the drivers being the inequality that I've already mentioned, but there's also this resentment and resistance that we are experiencing, especially where the Constitution is concerned, and also just in terms of leadership, institutional leadership. So those three combined, that's what led us to where we are right now, which we had called as the Gwara scenario, which is a state of lawlessness. Now, in the new scenarios, we've identified new key driving forces that will take us forward. And once again, the issues of institutions, but now in particular, the democratic institutions, the lack of accountability, the lack of leadership there is one of the major key driving forces. And that combined with the stagnant economy, because we've identified the sluggish economic growth as one of the key drivers. And lastly, what we've seen now as a third key driving force going forward is that of threats to our internal security. So we have all these threats that we don't quite well understand, and they're both internal and external. So a combination of those, so it would be the leadership and our institutions, especially the democratic institutions, the economy, and then how we navigate the future in terms of the security threats that we are facing as a country.
I'm just taking a look at your website and going through the scenarios that you had for 2030. And the last one you mentioned was the Gwara scenario, a floundering false dawn in a nation torn between immobility and restless energy. Gwara embodies a demoralized land of disorder and decay. The one before that is Nile Walk. And if I go back to the 2035 scenario, so these are the new scenarios that you're talking about, right?
Yes.
How much of the scenario planning would have had to be reworked given the outcomes of the election results, which I think perhaps came as somewhat of a surprise, even though we may have thought that the ANC would certainly decline by a large margin in 2024, we would not have said scraping through with 40% for the national election. But did you have to do some last-minute adjustments to your scenarios?
Yes, Michelle, you're quite correct. We've had to wait for the elections. I mean, before elections took place, we had called the future of coalitions in our country. So if you look at the three scenarios that we released, the high-level ones in November, they already mention coalition governments across all three new scenarios. So what we did was to wait a bit just to see how it unfolds. So now the biggest question we're facing is, where are we in terms of the three scenarios? Are we at the beginning of the Hadida scenario, or is it the vulture culture, or is it the Weaver scenario? So there is some debate around that. But overall, when you read the scenarios, I mean, I've been reading them closely as the things have been unfolding in the past few weeks. And we seem to be quite spot on, but I think it depends on where you are or where you are positioned in terms of the political spectrum and how you read it. So others would read it as this is now the beginning of the Weaver scenario of cooperation, and others would say it could be the Hadida scenario where there's lots of noise and bickering and without anything, really materializing, and that would be a centrist coalition that would be leading that. So, I mean, I think the scenarios themselves are quite spot on, but then, things are still unfolding, so we will see. But also we must be reminded that all three scenarios can coexist,
right.
But it's just a matter of which one is expressed the most.
Right. And I would urge our viewers to head on over to indlulamithi.org.za, have a look at scenario planning for 2035. And, 2035, Xolelwa, it's not a far way off. We were talking about 2030, 15 years ago as if it was a lifetime away. Here we are, 2024. 2035 is 11 years away. So much can change, as we know, in South Africa and in the world. And I imagine your scenarios are shifting with each passing week. And as you say, all three parts of it exist at the same time.
Yes, when we started this process of the 2035 scenarios, it was really a process of refreshing the 2030 scenarios, which were aligned to the National Development Plan, but also the SDGs of the United Nations. So we thought that would be a meaningful horizon. But then with a pandemic taking place, a lot of things started moving at a very fast rate. So that's when we thought, let's refresh. But what we came out with on the other end was a set of new scenarios, not even just refreshed 2030 scenarios. So that was the logic to 2035. Yes, it's not as long-term as desirable, but the starting point was that we were refreshing those scenarios that we wrote in 2018 and we launched in 2018. So, you're quite correct. Things are moving fast. The pandemic certainly did push us to refresh. And even just the events of the past 2 weeks have had to have us look closely at the storylines to find maybe, datelines that we might have missed. Some things maybe imagining them taking off in 2029, but especially where the electorate is concerned, these seem to be taking place now in 2024.
Now, what I'm noticing from the three scenarios for 2030 versus the three new ones for 2035 is that for 2030, the scenarios sort of get worse from 1, 2, and 3. For 2035, I think they get better. The Weaver is I think, just from my basic reading of the Weaver scenario, is the more, that's the one we're sort of aiming for, right? Do you want to take our viewers just very quickly? And it is on the landing page of indlulamithi.org.za if you want to go and have a look for yourself. But take us through these three animal and nature-based scenarios and what they would mean for our country.
Okay, so I've already mentioned the key driving forces, which is the economy, the security issues, but also the institutions and lack of leadership. But now the storyline themselves, what we found interesting is that when we were trying to name them, we found ourselves going back full circle to the those scenarios that were imagined during the transition. These are the Mount Fleur scenarios that used birds. So the Hadida, we all know the Hadida is a very loud bird.
Oh, yeah.
It disrupts us in the morning, it's in our spaces, and it's quite scary. But the main thing is the loudness of it. So here it symbolizes a nation that is loud, where the blame game is the national sport. This Hadida home is led by a centrist social democratic coalition that governs South Africa. But there's unease and foreboding in this Hadida home. The buck stops nowhere. There's half-hearted reforms, poor implementation, and graft continues. So then you see an impatient nation in the Hadida home. Then the second one is the vulture culture, which is, as you can imagine, vultures are these scavengers. So it's a scavenging nation that scavenges itself, but also there's other scavengers out there. Vultures are these very talented scavengers who can push away any other smaller birds, for what they regard as theirs. So what we see here is, again, another coalition, but this time around it's authoritarian and populist. It merges out of the notion of a return to traditional values. And because of this notion, you see a lot of defections from all political parties, including the ANC, to form this populist, but then it emerges as authoritarian coalition government that rules in the vulture culture. They use institutions such as SABC board to actually back directives, and those institutions become lapdogs of government to a point where even other African countries discredit our 2034 election because of this vulture culture that has criminal syndicates taking over services that are meant to be provided by the state because the state is just incapable and is focused on graft. Then the last one is the weaver work, which you say is positive. And this one, it's actually, I mean, these tiny yellow birds who build these perfect nests, and they're quite cooperative. You always see them in groups. So there'll be groups of these nests, or they'll build large nests, especially the Kalahari weaver bird. So it's about cooperation here. But this doesn't come easy. It comes as a result of continuation of things as we know them after the 2024 elections. And there's little improvement in service delivery. There's no accountability to a point where South Africans get absolutely hurtful and the nation erupts into protest. So as a result of these social movements that are youth-led, led by artists who then fall into protest culture mode, much like what happened in the 1980s. We see faith-based organizations also coming in, putting pressure on business, who then invest in these social movements. And as a result, a new coalition that is broad and promises to listen to the people emerges after at that time when we get to the 2034 elections, but it starts by around 2020 to 29. And it's a result of popular movements from below. So those are the three scenarios.
I mean, it's fascinating. And as you say, various aspects can be drawn out of all three scenarios, right? We can pull positives and negatives out of each scenario, and we can perhaps relate to a little bit of each scenario for the position that we're in at the moment as a country, one day before the inauguration of the president-elect. Xolelwa, let me thank you for your time this afternoon. I look forward to us having this conversation again before 2029, see where we are with those three scenarios. Xolelwa Kashe-Katiya is the project lead at Indlulamithi South Africa Scenarios. I would urge you to go on over to their website, have a look, have a read for yourself.